This is something that I'm honestly pretty surprised that nobody's really talked about before. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've seen my fair share of darkest episodes of cartoons from many YouTubers, a couple of them notably being the mysterious Mr. Enter, Blame It on George, and the like, but to be fair, no matter where I've honestly looked, even in the more deeper side of this episode was never really mentioned much, which is a little weird given how this episode was kind of dark and exceedingly realistic when it came to the subject matter it was trying to talk about. Now, what episode is this, and specifically from what show? Well, if you read the title, this episode is from Season 1, Episode 15B of Wow Wow Wubbzy entitled, Widget Gets the Bluey Blues. Now, I'm sure that your memories might have suddenly just exploded with nostalgia after me mentioning the show, and I can't really blame you for it. Personally, for me, I actually grew up watching the show a lot as a kid, and even watching it now, it's still pretty solid in terms of episode structuring, plot, and even some pretty funny jokes every now and again, which, especially with the way that Nick Jr. is at the moment, is saying a lot. So with that all said, what exactly is this episode about, and why is it so dark that it needed its own video? Well, my little shadows, I think it's best to start this all off from the very start, and that is with the episode itself. So let's get to that. To summarize, Widget Gets the Bluey Blues starts off with Widget getting her kite stuck into a tree, to which Wubbzy and Walden come into the scene and mention this to her. Widget then explains that she purposely did this because she wanted to test out her newest invention, the Happy Hopper 3000, which was created to get anything that gets stuck in trees or buildings or the like, or any specific high place, out of them. It's then that Widget pulls out a remote and then attempts to turn the machine on, only for nothing to happen. She attempts this again, only for the same thing to happen. She tries it a few more times at a rapid pace, and even goes out of her way to completely rebuild the machine before ultimately giving up trying, and soon decides to quit inventing things altogether. Now, while to some this might come across as a bit of a stretch in terms of a reaction, but if you've ever actually watched the show, Widget has had numerous inventions of hers either fail entirely or go completely haywire. In fact, it's actually quite a common theme in nearly every single episode of the show. She even has a catchphrase to go with it. That wasn't supposed to happen. So Widget ultimately giving up entirely on creating new machines, because ultimately this being the final straw, was something that was eventually going to happen, whether sooner or later. And in this episode, it actually manages to work well with the theme and the plot of the episode. After that event, the episode would then transition over to the next day, with Wubbzy going over to Widget's house to see how she's doing, only to find her lying in bed, groaning. Wubbzy then tries to find a way to help out his friend by doing some funny faces and even making her a card. But instead of making her feel better, she instead gets bluer and bluer with each attempt. This in turn has Wubbzy going to Walden to try and find out what's going on with Widget, and to see if they could try and do anything to help her out. Walden then proceeds to pull out a book and then explains that what Widget was going through was called the Bluey Blues, basically a kid version of depression. Upon explanation, both Walden and Wubbzy go out of their way to try and, again, help Widget out in any way they possibly can, and they do so through various comedic ways, like telling jokes and even dressing up like clowns and throwing pies at each other. Unfortunately, like the last attempt, nothing works, and she continues to get bluer. It's then that the episode would go to both Wubbzy and Walden checking out the Hopper machine and attempting to try and fix it up in any way that they can, hoping that by doing so they would help Widget feel better. After a bit of searching, Wubbzy finds the source of the problem, which is the batteries not being put into the machine properly, and of course, puts them both back in. Upon ultimately turning the machine on, it starts up. However, it then immediately starts going out of control with Wubbzy inside. Walden, of course, worriedly, immediately hurries into Widget's house and proceeds to explain the situation to Widget, which causes her to spring into action and have her and Walden chase down Wubbzy while hilarity in itself continues. In the end, Widget manages to catch the machine by using a net and power it off, thus saving Wubbzy in the process. Her bluey blues immediately go away, and things immediately go right back to normal, with Widget at the end saying that, quote, "Even if the invention didn't work, there's no reason to feel down, because as long as I have my friends, I'm a big success." Overall, the way that this episode was played out, while definitely being a bit dark for a happy-go-lucky show as this, managed to not only be realistic in terms of how depression is in actual people, although let's be a little bit honest here, it didn't cover every aspect of it because again, it is a kid's show, but also managed to be rather respectful and smart about the way the subject was portrayed, especially when it came to the various attempts from both Walden and Wubbzy to try and help cheer her up, and it failing as it did. Normally, if something like this was ultimately used in any kind of kid show outside of something like this, it's usually played down way too much, and more often than not, the character would immediately cheer up, which, as someone like myself who has dealt with and still does suffer from depression, having a show actually go out of its way and realistically portray it as it was a very, very nice touch. Now, of course, while it isn't particularly mentioned in the name, the fact that depression was used for this episode was kind of a bold move for the writers of the show, given the fact that many series and, well, specifically many studios and the like, usually try not to go into subject matter like this, especially for a show that's geared for a much, much younger audience. There are obviously exceptions to this, like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Bluey, and a few others and the like, but even then, it still is a very big, very huge and bold move. But I will say that despite that though, they did manage to actually do it in such a way that wasn't just toned down a good bit for a younger audience, it also managed to not sugarcoat it too much to where it actually would help out when it comes to talking about mental health, especially with kids. I mean, of course it doesn't go out of its way to play it down like it's nothing like many cartoons unfortunately tend to do, or even play it out wrong like others, Steven Universe. It handles it in a very good way, and gives the opportunity for kids who ultimately might watch this episode to actually go out of their way and ask questions and come to a better quality of understanding regarding mental health, rather than, of course, being terrified by it or given the wrong impression, thus in turn further stigmatizing the issue. Subjects about mental health aren't something that's really new in the realms of kid shows, like I've mentioned before. I mean, again, plenty of shows and the like have managed to do it quite well. A good example of this being Author, Bluey, probably, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and at least a few others and the like. But having a show, especially on Nick Jr. of all places, go out of their way for Nick Jr., with of course a show being Wow Wow Wubbzy covering something like this and doing it as well as it did, is something that I will say that personally for me, I believe that this is a subject matter that many shows can and really should continue to do. A lot more specifically with more younger audience related shows, rather than of course having sugar-laden crap like Paw Patrol and Blades and the Monster Machines. I really don't remember the name of it, but then again, it's such a forgettable show that I really don't even care, but still, it really rings true. Many shows and the like really should start doing this a lot more. Now, I'm not saying every show should, because again, not every show is meant or even is supposed to go out of their way and do subject matter like this, but it would definitely be a lot nicer if more shows managed to do so. Now, in conclusion, this was a very well done episode. A very dark concept and the like being used, even though I guess it's kind of a subjective term. Sitting there and using something like this definitely is something that is a little out of the ordinary, especially with a show like Wow Wow Wubbzy, but I'm really glad that they actually managed to portray it in such a manner in a way that, again, was very respectful and was also very informative as well. And not to mention, of course, realistic. I know I've mentioned that a few times, but it still rings true. But even with that stated, what do you all think? I'd like to personally hear your own thoughts about this. Do you guys think that this episode was dark? Do you guys think it wasn't? Are there any other episodes from the show that perhaps may have actually covered another topic that might have been a little bit darker? Do you have any ideas or any other show that's rather obscure that hasn't been talked about that has covered dark concepts that you want me to cover? Let me know down in the comments section below. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Anyway, thanks again for watching today's episode, My Little Shadows. I know it's kind of different from the typical creepypasta narrations I tend to do, but I thought that I'd switch it up a little bit. Mostly because this is something that kind of popped up in my head and won't leave me alone, so what a great way to sit there and ultimately include this. And who's to say this might actually be included in a future video by myself or someone else, and if that's the case, awesome. But yeah, thanks again for watching today, thanks again for watching My Little Shadows, and like always, roll the outro because I'm out.
In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping, horror-driven, nightmarish, gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.